And here we are once again, with more inaccuracies. Someone had the idea of perhaps pointing out some of the inaccuracies in the novels that the entire franchise is based off of. And I'm gonna do that right now. But I will admit, this is a bit more difficult since, well, there are descriptions, of course, and there are inaccuracies to point out, but obviously as a book, a lot of it is imagination. You get a picture in your head of what the animal should look like. But obviously it's going to be pretty impossible to nitpick anything because, well, we can't see actual visual details of these particular creatures since, well, it's all text-based. But there are things to point out. And at first I was gonna omit my general rule of not doing repeats and just do everything. But first of all, there are just a lot of dinosaurs in the first book. And second of all, honestly, most of the repeats would have the same issues I've already mentioned. The raptors, for example, are still completely wrong. They're called Velociraptor, yet obviously not being that. The Rex, actually, is less accurate in the book portrayal, interestingly enough. For one thing, it's kind of described as a tripod stance, which we know is wrong. But the other issue, and the big one, is that Crichton gave her this weird prehensile tongue, which is, no, not something that I could associate with that particular animal. But the Dilophosaurus and the Compies are more accurate. In the Compies case, they stick with the name Procompsognathus. They do have the venom bite thing, which has no basis, and there's no feathers, of course, but that's a pretty consistent issue. But because of the consistency of them being Procompsognathus, they are a bit more accurate. And Dilophosaurs are much more accurate, actually. They do have the venom spit, though it's not black tar like in the movie. It's described as a yellow foam. But they don't have the frill, and they're much more in line with the actual size of Dilophosaurus. But overall, the other repeats just don't really have anything for me to add in any real way. So with that, let's discuss the least to most accurate dinosaurs in the Jurassic Park novel. Meganura is not a dinosaur. This is an insect? What? And yeah, a lot of people don't even know this was in the book. This is a giant dragonfly that would have existed in the late Carboniferous. They're part of an extinct group called griffin flies, and the largest species, Meganura moni, would have had a wingspan of 2 feet. They were huge, making them in fact the largest known flying insect during their time. Though the largest insect that has ever lived that we know about was Meganuropsis, which would have had a wingspan of up to 2.3 feet. Either way, these were really, really big bugs. And yes, they do appear in the novel very briefly. It's unknown how they were cloned exactly, and Dr. Grant mentions that they would have existed during the Jurassic period, but that doesn't sound right, since Meganura was extinct before then. But in terms of their exact descriptions, well, frankly, they're just wrong for any known species of prehistoric dragonfly, purely because they are way too big. The novel describes them as red in color with 6-foot wingspans, which is insane. Like, yeah, prehistoric insects were pretty big, but not that big. Additionally, frankly, there's no way these insects could be alive in the modern day, like at all, even if they were cloned, because the reason why insects got so big in the past is that there was much higher oxygen content in the atmosphere. Due to the way insects breathe, that higher oxygen content allowed them to get much bigger. But when the oxygen content started dropping, evolution dictated they would get smaller again in order to survive. A large bug like this just couldn't breathe in the modern day, and even the book describes a Stegosaurus having similar issues, wheezing, trying to breathe in the modern atmosphere. The only way these creatures could be alive is if they were heavily modified and given proper lungs, which just sounds bizarre for a bug, frankly. But then again, they are so much bigger that I guess that makes sense? But there's no mention of this kind of gene modification in the novel. In fact, when Dr. Wu tries to convince Hammond to allow him to modify some of the animals in order to make them more manageable, Hammond sternly resists it, believing that they should remain truly accurate to the way they were. So it seems unlikely that this would have happened, so I don't know. The point is, it's wrong. I think that's obvious. Nanosaurus. These were small herbivorous ornithopod dinosaurs that lived in the late Jurassic period. Now, the word Nanosaurus doesn't actually appear in the novel. Crichton wrote it using the synonym Othnielia. Once thought to be a separate species, they're now the same, and Nanosaurus had priority. But in any event, we're talking about the same animal. They live side by side with Dryosaurus, but Nanosaurus is portrayed as being partially arboreal, climbing trees pretty regularly. And this just isn't an accurate portrayal of them anymore. Yes, it is wrong, but to be fair, it was once surmised that this might be the case. But it's now thought they were pretty much always terrestrial. Could they climb trees? I mean, maybe. A lot of animals can climb a tree if they really wanted to, but it's no longer believed that this was a regular occurrence, even though it's one of their defining characteristics as they're described in the novel. Cearadactylus. These are pterosaurs that lived in the early Cretaceous period, and interestingly, they're even misidentified in the novel, like in canon, because a lot of the characters refer to them as pterodactyls. But when Dr. Grant finally sees them, he realizes that this can't be the case. They are much too large. They must be Cearadactylus. They're described with the membranous wings and could fold up and walk with clawed forearms for grasping fish, which actually doesn't sound too far off, and they seem a lot sturdier than they probably should be. According to the novel, the Cearadactyls would actually fold their wings up and dive, striking their target with such force that it would even knock them unconscious. And John Arnold explains this doesn't seem to hurt the Cearadactyls at all, which, no, I don't think they would have been able to take a blow like that, but not too far off based on the description we have. Stegosaurus and Hadrosaurus. These two animals I'm putting in the same exact spot, squarely in the middle of the list. And the reason I'm doing this is because, frankly, I just don't have a description to give you. They're revealed to be in the park. We know they're there, but any description given to them is so loose that it's impossible for me to rate them in terms of accuracy at all. I mean, their names are right. Those are both genuses of dinosaur, so yeah, that's fine. Outside of that, though, I don't really have anything to say, so they are squarely middle of the road. Dryosaurus. So, this is a weird one, and honestly, in terms of their accuracy to being Dryosaurus, it isn't too bad, but the problem is the name. But I'm also going to defend it on the basis that this really isn't Crichton's fault. See, barring a single instance, these animals are consistently referred to as Hypsilophodont. Now, Hypsilophodon used to be considered very closely related to Dryosaurs, so that's understandable, but more recent research dictates that, no, they probably weren't, and they definitely weren't synonyms of each other. As a result, the inaccuracy has to do with obtaining more information about the animal. These are definitely Dryosaurs, not Hypsilophodon, but they are generally, almost always, referred to as Hypsilophodon in the novel. Myosaura. It's the good mother lizard. Out of all the animals in the first Jurassic Park novel, Myosaur's probably the most accurate by a significant margin. They're portrayed as being fairly docile and rearing their young, and that's a pretty critical point because a big part of this animal that they actually took care of their offspring. And I think it's a very important thing to hammer home about them. It's one of their defining characteristics, so definitely bonus points in that regard. And with that, a special thank you goes out to my Apex Predators, Arthur Roy, Metal for Life Guy, and Dr. Racer78. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.